In 1976, Cape May, New Jersey, received two verdicts within 6 months of each other. On May 11th, the federal government declared the entire town a National Historic Landmark. Not a single building, the whole place, block by block, protected by law. On November 2nd, voters up the same coastline legalized casino gambling in a town 40 miles north. Same state, same ocean, same year. It was not the first time the two towns had answered the same question differently. 98 years earlier, in one November night in 1878, fire crossed Cape May's wooden center in under 11 hours. And by the hotel's own surviving account, never confirmed in a newspaper of the time, cut the town's rooms from 2,200 to 200 before sunrise. This is the story of a town that lost every contest it entered and the strange arithmetic by which losing saved it. Chapter 1. The First Resort. Losing came later. In 1766, Cape May did not have a rival, a contest, or anything to lose. It had a newspaper advertisement printed in Philadelphia, offering a large, good 2-story house at the southern tip of New Jersey, open to the sea within a mile and a half of the shore, where people already resorted for their health and for bathing in the water. It ran in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and by the account most historians accept, it is the first documented advertisement for seaside bathing printed anywhere in the country, a generation before George Washington took the oath of office. The exact hand behind it is lost to time. What survives is the claim itself, and the claim was true. This stretch of coast really was the place to go. The reason had nothing to do with the water being better here than anywhere else on the Atlantic seaboard, and everything to do with where the water was. Cape May sits at the southern tip of a narrow peninsula, ocean on one side, the mouth of Delaware Bay on the other. And for a young country whose money and whose sickness were concentrated in 3 cities inland, that position mattered more than any other fact about the town. It was the nearest salt water for Philadelphia, for Baltimore, for Washington, decades before a single mile of railroad had been laid anywhere near this coast. A wagon, then a boat, then eventually a boat alone, was the whole of the technology required to get here. In 1801, a man named Ellis Hughes opened the island's first real hotel, the Atlantic Hotel, a working inn with a proprietor and a register, at a time when most visitors to Cape Island still boarded in spare rooms rented out by local farm families for the season. That same year, a stagecoach line began running from Philadelphia, a 2-day journey over unpaved roads through the pine country of southern New Jersey. It was slow, it was uncomfortable. People came anyway, and by 1816 they no longer needed the stagecoach. Regular steamboat service began running from Philadelphia by way of Newcastle, Delaware, cutting the trip to a single day on the water. By mid-century, the round trip cost $6, meals included, and the boat left every morning. The same year the steamboat started, a Cape Island man named Thomas H. Hughes built something the town had not seen before, a boarding house so large that his neighbors could not imagine who would ever fill it. Cape Island in 1816 was still a scatter of farmhouses and a single real hotel. Hughes's building rose above all of it, financed on nothing but his own confidence that the summer trade would keep growing the way it had been growing for 50 years. The town did not share his confidence. Locals called the place Tommy's Folly, the joke being that a man had bet his fortune on a building this size in a village this small, and would be the one left owning the debt when the rooms stayed empty. The rooms did not stay empty. In 1828, Hughes was elected to the United States House of Representatives, and he renamed his hotel for the institution that had just elected him. Tommy's Folly became Congress Hall. The name has not changed since. 27 years after a joke about a building too big for its town, the joke had become an address that a sitting president chose for himself. In 1855, Franklin Pierce spent a week at Congress Hall, the first president of the United States to summer anywhere on the New Jersey shore, and he picked the hotel that Cape Island had once mocked as an old fool's overreach. Pierce would not be the last president to sign the register there, and within a few years of his visit, Congress Hall was no longer the largest thing this town was building. Southern planter families, arriving by steamer from 100 miles down the coast for the length of a season, were about to be followed by a wave of construction the island had never attempted before. Each new hotel larger than the one before it, built by men who assumed, reasonably enough for the country's oldest resort, that after 9 decades of being first, Cape May would simply go on being first forever. Chapter 2. The Golden Age. The hotels kept getting bigger, and the guests filling them were, more than any other single group, Southern. Planter families arrived each summer for the length of the season, some of them, by one surviving account, from as far south as Savannah, Georgia. Cape May sat below a line that mattered to these families in a way Newport and Saratoga, further up the coast, did not, and its hoteliers built around that fact without needing to advertise it directly. The wealth of the low country came north every June and went home every September, and for 3 decades, nobody putting up a new hotel here had reason to plan for a summer when it wouldn't come. That wealthy, predictable calendar built more than hotel rooms. It built Congress Hall's reputation as the resort's political address. James Buchanan signed the register there as a sitting president in 1858. 3 years after Franklin Pierce had done the same. Ulysses S. Grant would sign it too as president on July the 13th, 1875. The war that separated those two signatures didn't change which hotel a president chose when he came to this coast. Congress Hall's register was becoming an argument in itself, the sort hoteliers up and down the coast repeated when they needed to explain why a family should choose Cape May over anywhere else on the Atlantic seaboard. That confidence and that wealth was what convinced a group of Philadelphia investors to begin construction in 1852 on the largest hotel Cape May, or the country, had ever attempted. Being the biggest was still, on this stretch of coast, the same thing as being the best, and no one wanted to be the hotel that let a rival take that title first. They called it the Mount Vernon Hotel, and they advertised it as the largest hotel in the world. A claim whose exact size depends on which source is telling it, anywhere from 2,100 to 3,500 guests. It did not open on schedule. When the Mount Vernon finally received its first guests in 1854, both of its planned wings were still unbuilt. A hotel advertised as the biggest in the world, opening without the rooms that would have made the claim true. 1,000 guests checked in anyway, into rooms offering something no other hotel on the island had yet offered. Running water piped directly to the room, and gas lighting instead of a candle. On the night of September the 5th, 1856, the Mount Vernon burned. The fire was suspected arson from the start. A former housekeeper was named as a suspect, though she was never convicted. 6 people died, among them the hotel's manager, a man named Kane, and his 3 children. The hotel was never rebuilt. What had been advertised 2 years earlier as the largest hotel on Earth was, in a single night, gone. A few months later, the mansion house burned as well. Between the 2 fires, Cape May lost 2,400 hotel rooms in under a year, a number the resort would spend most of the next 2 decades trying to replace. The rebuilding continued anyway, because the guests kept coming, and because nobody putting up a new hotel in 1858 or 1859 had reason to expect they would stop. They stopped in 1861. Congress Hall, by one account, flew a South Carolina flag on its lawn that spring, the kind of gesture a resort makes when a large share of its business comes from below a line on a map. The flag did not survive the season, and neither did the business behind it. The planter families who had filled Cape May's hotels every June for 3 decades did not come back that summer. Most of them did not come back at all. Cape May spent the years that followed rebuilding what the fires and the war had both taken room by room, the way it had always built, expensively, certain that 9 decades of being first meant it would go on being first. 40 miles up the coast, on a barrier island with no docks or roads, a Philadelphia physician and an engineer were looking at the same stretch of empty sand and arriving at a different answer than Cape May had ever needed. Not a bigger hotel, but a railroad, built straight to the water before anyone else got there. Chapter 3. The 9-year Head Start. The physician was not from Philadelphia. Jonathan Pitney had spent nearly 2 decades practicing medicine in the fishing village of Absecon, New Jersey, before deciding the coast needed a railroad laid straight from the city to the water, nothing in between to slow it down. The engineer beside him, Richard Osborne, was the Philadelphia man. He understood what a direct route was worth. On March the 19th, 1852, the two of them incorporated the Camden and Atlantic Railroad. Construction began that December. The bill came to $1,200,000, and it bought 59 8/10 miles of track across pine barrens and salt marsh that had never carried anything heavier than a farm wagon. On the 1st of July, 1854, that track reached its end at a barrier island so undeveloped that the men off the first train finished the last stretch on open sand, no road beneath their feet. 600 guests came on that inaugural run. Politicians, newspapermen, the kind of crowd a new venture invites when it wants its opening remembered. 2.5 hours. The entire distance in time between the wharves of Camden and a beach that, the week before, had belonged to nobody in particular. Within a few years, the settlement growing around that railhead would be called Atlantic City, a resort with a direct line to Philadelphia before it was much of anything else. Cape May noticed the way an old family notices new money moving in down the road, politely, without much concern. It had 90 years of history this upstart on the sand did not have, and a president's signature already in its hotel register. Its name traveled the length of the Atlantic seaboard. A railroad, in the calculation Cape May's hoteliers were making, was a convenience, not a threat. 9 decades of proof that people would come by boat or by stage simply because Cape May was worth the trouble, that not a rail timetable was what the town believed had built it, and would go on building it. The difference took 9 years to arrive, and even then, not directly. The Cape May and Millville Railroad was chartered March the 9th, 1863, and began running that August. 41 6/10 miles, routed not straight up from Camden, but out through Millville first, a detour built into the line from the day it opened. The trip that once took the better part of a day by steamboat now took about 3.5 hours by rail. It was, by any earlier measure, a triumph. It was also 9 years too late and 1 turn too many. The math that decided the next half-century did not care how many presidents had signed which hotel register. A family planning a single day at the shore, the kind of trip becoming for the first time affordable to people who were not planters or bankers, chose the destination that cost less and took less time. Atlantic City offered a straight run from Camden at a lower fare. Cape May offered a longer one, through Millville, priced higher, to a town that had never had to compete for a visitor and had built nothing for the trade. No pier, no boardwalk, to handle a crowd that came for an afternoon instead of a season. Atlantic City grew the way a place grows when the arithmetic sits entirely on its side. 250 people lived there in 1854, the year the first train came in. By the census of 1900, the count stood at more than 27,000, 108 times over in 45 years. Cape May's population crept forward at the pace of a town living on a reputation instead of a railroad. It had been the first resort on this coast for 90 years. By 1900, the census no longer had a reason to call it that. Cape May still held one advantage no railroad timetable could touch: The hotels themselves, the porches, the register full of famous names, the sense, however faded, of a place that mattered because it always had. It was a considerable inheritance. Every piece of it, porches included, was built of wood that had been standing on this coast, salted and dried by the same wind off the Atlantic for the better part of a century. Chapter 4. The Night of November 9th. That wood was the whole of Cape May's fortune by the autumn of 1878, and on the morning of November the 9th, at about 7 o'clock, it caught fire. Workers on the roof of the Stockton Hotel were the first to see it, smoke rising thin and pale from the direction of Ocean House, a few blocks off on Perry Street. Cape May had had small fires before, put out inside an hour, forgotten within the season. This one did not behave that way. A northwest wind was blowing at 35 miles an hour, gusting past 50, and it took the flame off the Ocean House roof and carried it straight down Perry Street, the way a wind carries anything light and dry across an open field. The hotels standing along that street had been built by the same rule for 60 years. Wood, close together, porches touching porches, no brick, no distance, nothing between one roof and the next but a few feet of November air. The wind did not have to work for its fire. The street had been built to burn as a single piece, and on the morning of November the 9th, it did. Guests still on the island for the tail end of the season went into the street with whatever they could carry, joining hotel staff and townspeople already moving ahead of the smoke. There was time for that, if for little else. The fire did not trap anyone inside the buildings it took. It simply took the buildings, one after another, faster than any line of men with buckets could have slowed it, with or without the equipment the town had on hand. That equipment was little enough to begin with. One-hand pump. 1,500 feet of hose, which tore apart in sections as it was laid across the street, the rubber giving out under pressure it had never been built to hold. 3 chemical engines. 1 ladder. The fire chief had gone before the town council earlier that year and asked for money to replace equipment he already knew was inadequate for a fire of any real size. The council had turned him down. What Cape May had instead, on the morning of November the 9th, was a hose that failed and a pump built for a fire a tenth the size of the one now moving down Perry Street with the wind behind it. A steam pump was put on a train in Camden, 90 miles up the line, the only machine anywhere in the region with the capacity to answer a fire like this one. It arrived by early afternoon. By the time it did, Congress Hall was gone. Ocean House was gone. Columbia House and Center House were gone with them, and at least 3 more hotels beside. And the steam pump that might have saved any one of them arrived in time to help save what was left of the town instead. The fire burned for roughly 11 hours before it was finally contained. And when it was done, it had taken something close to 40 acres at the center of the resort. The same acres that had held for 60 years every hotel that had ever made Cape May's reputation. By the account kept in the history of the Chalfonte, the one major hotel the fire never reached, Cape May's room count fell that night from 2,200 to 200. No surviving newspaper from 1878 puts the number in print. Nobody who watched Perry Street burn needed one to tell them what they had lost. No one died in it. That fact would be repeated for years afterward, by people who had watched their hotels disappear and still counted the day, on balance, as something short of the worst thing that could have happened. By morning, Cape May was a town standing at the edge of 38 to 40 acres of ash, looking at what was left of 90 years of building, with winter 6 weeks off and nowhere left to put a guest. Within days, Philadelphia's newspapers had an opinion about what should rise from that ash. Cape May had one too. The 2 opinions did not agree. Ballant Chapter 5. The Wrong Decision. Philadelphia's papers were not vague about what they meant. Rebuild it modern, they advised. Brick and stone where there had been wood, hotels large enough to hold their own, against whatever Atlantic City or Newport built next. It was reasonable counsel, the kind a city on the rise offers a smaller neighbor that has just watched 40 acres of itself turn to ash overnight. Cape May read it and did the opposite. The men who had owned the great hotels on Perry Street were, that winter, working with less capital than the burned buildings had cost to put up in the first place. What capital remained went toward caution rather than ambition. Nobody who had just watched a spark on a shingle roof erase 90 years of construction in 11 hours wanted to build the next version of that same risk, only bigger. And the guests still coming to Cape May were families who had summered here for 2 and 3 generations, whose loyalty ran to the town itself rather than to whichever hotel offered the newest gaslight fixture. What they wanted rebuilt was not grandeur. It was familiarity, sized to what a family could afford to insure twice. So the great hotel lots were cut apart. Where a single building had once run the length of a block, deeds now described narrow parcels 40 and 50 feet wide. And on those parcels rose something Cape May had never built in quantity before: small wooden cottages, gabled and porched, ornamented in the fussy Victorian manner the era favored, built for one family rather than for a season's worth of paying strangers. Much of that rebuilding ran through a single drafting table. Stephen Decatur Button, a Philadelphia-trained architect already at work on the island before the fire, spent the years after 1878 as the town's de facto rebuilder. Hotels reconstructed in brick where brick could be afforded, private cottages turned out by the dozen where it could not. He built for the money the town actually had, not the money Philadelphia's editorial writers assumed it still had. Congress Hall was the clearest evidence of the choice. It reopened in brick 90 days after the fire. Proof, the owners advertised, that the new building would not burn the way the old one had. It was also half the size of the hotel it replaced. Half the rooms, half the footprint. A fraction of what had stood on that corner in October. Speed had been bought with scale. The town had chosen fireproof and small over grand and slow, and nobody rebuilding through the winter of 1879 seemed to think there was another option worth arguing for. Not every commission that year followed the rule. In 1879, the same year Congress Hall reopened at half its former footprint, the Philadelphia architect Frank Furness designed a mansion on Washington Street for a young doctor named Emlyn Physick, his widowed mother, and an unmarried aunt. An 18-room house of deliberately strange proportions, chimneys turned upside down, gables cut at odd angles, nothing about it modest or cautious. It stood alone against everything rising around it that year. A town that could not afford to rebuild its future had, without quite meaning to, bought itself something closer to eternity. Cape May tried to close the gap exactly once more. In 1904, Pittsburgh industrialists organized the Cape May Real Estate Company around a plan closer to Philadelphia's old advice than anything built since the fire: 3,600 to 4,000 acres modeled on Newport, Rhode Island. Anchored by a grand hotel, Cape May meant to compete with anything on the coast. The hotel opened in 1908 and closed within 6 months, not long after the company's president, Peter Shields, resigned and took the venture's momentum with him. Of the 700 building lots platted for Newport-style villas, fewer than 100 ever sold. Nelson Graves bought the wreckage in 1910 and tried again, building an amusement park beside the failing hotel. He was bankrupt by 1914. The hotel itself passed through 5 separate bankruptcies before the century was out, never again drawing the crowd its Newport model had promised. Grandeur, Cape May had now proven twice, was not a thing this town could hold on to even when it tried. After 1914, it stopped trying. What came next was not another attempt. It was a long, quiet settling in. A town that had run out of reasons to compete and was beginning, without much notice from anyone, to fall asleep. Chapter 6. The Long Sleep. The sleep did not happen by accident. In 1897, the state of New Jersey outlawed gambling, and Cape May, which had never built its trade on games of chance, the way some resorts along this coast had, simply let the ruling stand. 2 years later, in 1899, the town lost its license to sell liquor as well, and this time the choice sat closer to home. A resort built on 3 generations of family loyalty saw little worth defending in the saloon trade. Between the 2 rulings, whatever loud amusement Cape May still had left went dark inside of 24 months. Nobody organized a protest. There was nothing left to protest for. 40 miles up the coast, in those same years, a rival resort was building its entire identity on exactly what Cape May had just switched off. Gambling and liquor were not vices Atlantic City merely tolerated. They were becoming the whole of its business, tacitly permitted, openly advertised in everything but name. Cape May, meanwhile, settled into what the historians who have studied it since call, without much elaboration, a period of insignificance, not a collapse anyone could point to, just a slow drop out of the conversation about where the country's fashionable resorts were. What Cape May had left, by every account from the period, was a reputation as the quiet, family resort on this stretch of coast, the kind of place people returned to out of habit rather than discovery. Nobody was building anything new to attract a stranger. The houses raised after the fire of 1878 grew old, the way houses grow old when the money to maintain them stops arriving on schedule. Porches sagging, paint going unrenewed, rooms built for one family carved into 4 and 5 for the rooming trade, the whole structure finally wrapped in a skin of cheap asbestos shingle that at least kept the weather out. This was not restoration. It was upkeep on the smallest possible budget, applied by owners who had stopped expecting the town to matter to anyone outside it again. By the 1920s, the contrast up the coast had sharpened into something close to cruelty. Enoch Johnson, the boss who ran Atlantic City through Prohibition, was clearing something in the neighborhood of $500,000 a year from liquor that never stopped flowing, gambling rooms that never closed, and an arrangement with the local police that made the whole operation close to official. Cape May's own liquor ban, obeyed without incident for 3 decades by then, had bought the town nothing measurable. Atlantic City, breaking the same law nightly, had bought itself a fortune. The quiet held for the better part of 6 decades until the sea itself decided to end it. In March of 1962, a storm that would come to be called the Ash Wednesday Storm, for the holy day it struck, battered the Jersey shore for the better part of 3 days, from the 6th of the month to the 8th. When it finally pulled back, 13 of Cape May's 15 boardwalk blocks were gone. Convention Hall, the town's largest public building, was damaged beyond any repair that made financial sense. Across Cape May County, more than 1,200 houses were destroyed outright, and water stood 2 feet deep in streets that had never flooded within living memory. There was no boardwalk empire left to envy now, and no family loyalty large enough to paper over what the storm had done. The town that had spent 6 decades quietly declining now looked for the first time finished. A resort with no gambling, no liquor trade, a broken boardwalk, and rooming houses held together with asbestos shingle and habit. It was at this lowest point, with the water still standing on Washington Street, that Cape May looked less worth saving than at any moment before or since. Word was already moving south from the capital that money would follow the wreckage. Federal dollars, earmarked for something the planners were already calling renewal. Before a single dollar of it arrived, the government sent someone else first, an architect, assigned to walk the storm-broken streets and write down exactly what was still standing. Chapter 7. The Bulldozer and the Architect. The money did arrive, eventually, and by the time it did, Cape May had a mayor who already knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. Frank Govey took office in 1964, convinced the town's problem was not too little history, but too much of it. Old hotels, older cottages, porches sagging under decades of unrenewed paint, none of it, in his reading, worth the cost of saving. Modern visitors wanted modern rooms, air conditioning, parking close to the door. Govey pursued demolition with the confidence of a man rescuing a town rather than erasing one. By 1969, more than 100 documented 19th century structures were gone. 3 new streets had been cut through the old downtown, and a high-rise called Victorian Towers stood where a scatter of 19th century rooming houses once had. In 1967, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development approved his plan and backed it with $3 million. The centerpiece was a 77-acre development the planners named Victorian Village, a pedestrian mall and shopping center, its storefronts dressed in ornamental facades, built to resemble exactly the buildings coming down around them. Cape May was not being modernized. It was being replaced with a picture of itself, built from plywood and paint over the ruins of the real thing. Enter Carolyn Pitts. The National Park Service had sent her to Cape May in 1962 after the Ash Wednesday storm with a narrow assignment: catalog the historic building still standing so federal planners would know what they had to work with. She kept at the work long after the storm damage was recorded, cataloging on through the years the city spent deciding what to tear down, until the demolition crews began treating her file as a punch list instead of an inventory. Pitts watched the city that had hired her destroy, one building at a time, the structures she herself had counted and measured. She turned against the project and against the office that was paying for it. What followed was not one confrontation, but a decade of paperwork. Pitts wrote to residents listing what had already come down and what stood to go next, work precise enough and public enough that people who had never once thought about a cornice or a gable began keeping count alongside her. On December the 29th, 1970, that count produced its first hard result. The federal government placed the entire town of Cape May on the National Register of Historic Places. Not one building, all of it. The nomination bearing Pitts's own years of work. Not every rescue that decade came from a preservationist. In 1968, a radio evangelist named Carl McIntyre bought the failing Congress Hall with money raised on his daily broadcast and converted it into a conference center for his own ministry. No interest anywhere in his reasoning in Victorian architecture for its own sake. The building survived regardless, repurposed rather than condemned, standing through the same years the wrecking crews were working 2 streets over. 2 years later, in September of 1970, a small group of residents formed the Mid-Atlantic Center for the Arts for a single purpose: saving the Emlyn Physic Estate, the 18-room Frank Furness mansion, from the demolition list. The city bought the estate that year rather than tear it down, and the new center leased the building and restored it themselves, volunteers patching the roof and reglazing the windows with their own hands through that first winter. By 1972, the arithmetic of the town had shifted enough to reach the ballot box. Voters removed Govey from office and replaced him with Bruce Minix, a mayor who ran on preservation instead of renewal. The first time in this town, in a decade, that saving a building had been the winning position rather than the losing one. Cape May now had a federal listing, a rescued mansion, a converted hotel, and a former mayor's bulldozers standing idle. What it still did not have was the one designation that would make all of it permanent. That decision belonged to Washington, and it would arrive in the year the country turned 200 years old. Chapter 8. 2 Verdicts. Washington's decision arrived on May the 11th, 1976. The Department of the Interior designated the entire historic core of Cape May a National Historic Landmark District. Not one hotel, not one street. The whole town, boundary to boundary, 380 acres of it, more than 600 buildings inside the line. The designation was not a plaque. It was not an honor roll entry. It was not a suggestion for a city council to weigh against next year's budget. A National Historic Landmark carries the weight of federal law, and the town's own Preservation Commission, empowered by that same listing, gained the standing to reject a window, a fence, a roof line on any building inside those 380 acres, for any reason it saw fit. Cape May had spent a century losing every argument it entered. This one it won by doing nothing more than surviving long enough to be counted. 6 months later, on November the 2nd, 1976, the same state voted to give Atlantic City's future to a single industry. 56% of New Jersey said yes to casino gambling, on the condition that it stayed 40 miles north inside the boardwalk's own limits. Governor Brendan Byrne signed the Casino Control Act the following June, under Lautetsentren and Kreinerunde on the boardwalk itself. Resorts International opened the state's first casino floor in May of 1978. The bicentennial year had asked the same coastline the same question twice, 6 months apart, and had gotten two answers that could not have run further from each other. The mirror had already started turning before either vote was cast. In 1972, Atlantic City brought down the Traymore, once the grandest hotel on its skyline, in a controlled demolition that set a world record for its size. In the autumn of 1978, months after the casino vote, the Marlborough Blenheim came down for the lot a new casino would rise on. In 2021, Trump Plaza went the same way, 34 floors folding into their own footprint in under 20 seconds. 3 different decades, 3 different hotels, the same firm setting the charges each time. One family company, Controlled Demolition Incorporated, hired again and again across 50 years to clear away what Atlantic City's own gamble had made too expensive to keep standing. The tally today runs in numbers, not metaphors. Atlantic City's poverty rate stands at 32.3%, better than 2.5 times the national average. Cape May's stands at 10.3% below it. Atlantic City's median household income is $41,028. Cape May's is $62,576. Cape May itself counts fewer than 2,700 year-round residents, too small to have ever won a straight fight against its rival. Yet the county around it now draws 12.1 million visitors and $8.1 billion a year. Money spread across 16 towns. Not the city alone. Much of it paid to sleep in the same small, gabled cottages the fire's aftermath produced, rented out by the room, bed, and breakfast, by owners who never planned to run a hotel. Congress Hall is still on that street. Carl McIntyre's ministry kept its rooms open into the 1980s, on faith and radio pledges, until neither was enough. The guest floors went dark by the early 1990s and stayed dark for a decade. In 2002, McIntyre's own grandson reopened the hotel, $25 million in years of restoration later. The same building that had opened as Tommy's Folly in 1816 and been mocked, once, as too large for the town that built it. 40 miles south of the dark towers on any given evening, the painted ladies along Perry Street and Washington Street turn on their porch lights, small bulbs on cottages built from wood that could just as easily have burned twice, or been carted off by a bulldozer in 1968. Up the coast, the lots where the Traymore and the Marlborough Blenheim and Trump Plaza once stood sit dark, waiting on buyers who have not come. The lighthouse built in 1859 still turns its beam 24 miles out over both towns, unbroken since before either one had cast a single vote about what it wanted to become. It still finds them both every night the same.